Let's cast our minds back to 2012. The Mayans' plan to end the world was thwarted and everyone was now having to live with the consequences of their apocalypse orgies. It was also when Capcom started messing with their IPs to pander to the Western audience. Specifically, Resident Evil 6 was released this year to extremely whelmed responses from critics and pitchfork sharpening from the fanbase. And I would have left it at that, but as it turns out, Resident Evil 6 is the 4th best-selling Resident Evil title. Somehow, the worst mainstream title is better selling than Resident Evil 4. So I got to thinking, was it really as bad as I remember? Let's find out. But before all that, the Resident Gremlin humbly requests that you like and subscribe, helps the channel, and it's completely free. Go on, treat yourself. So naturally we're going to start with Leon's campaign, simply because I remember it being the closest to the earlier entries. Turns out, my memory is awful and the rose-tinted glasses are strong. The first cutscene, and I already have one major gripe. Leon tries to talk down the clearly zombified president. Oh, but he's Leon's bestie, I hear you cry. He's in denial. Yeah, sure, but this isn't Leon's first rodeo. In fact, it's his 6th time dealing with zombies and zombie-adjacent monstrosities. There shouldn't be any thinking. Pop, bang, zombie down. Then he just dead-ass tells Hunnigan that he shot the president.
I just shot the president.
What are you?
Leon, you absolute dingus. What follows is 5 to 10 minutes of slowly walking around an empty map, waiting for the plot to happen, and getting stuck behind the slowest man in existence. And then finally we get the first bit of action in the entire game, ignoring the prelude of course, and it's a goddamn QTE. You'll want to get used to this. It's no secret that Resident Evil 6 is generous when it comes to the application of QTEs, but the first thing you actually do, not a good start. And into the fray proper, by which I really mean a continuous gauntlet of zombies, which gives me time to talk about the general moment-to-moment gameplay. It's competent. That's probably the only way to describe it. The gunplay is decidedly meh, though the laser sight going on an adventure after every single shot isn't helping matters. Melee is arguably your best option to start with, seeing as it's almost guaranteed a kill, though there is an issue with this. Every time you do something that isn't shooting, the camera changes position. Melee, camera moves. Sprinting, camera moves. Doing your taxes, camera bloody moves. And when you're chaining actions together, the game just becomes a nauseating experience. There's also tripping. Remember tripping? It's back in RE6 form. Back to the action and we get more QTE weirdness. Turns out in the police car, even if you know the answer, you still have to go through the motions for the game to give the illusion of tension.
12 seconds later.
A very short ride later, and we're in the sewers and then the subway, and we have another wave assault of zombies because quantity is far better than quality, I guess. Not much to talk about apart from the trains, really. Not sure how they haven't derailed and are still running, but it's fine. Into the streets and even more zombie hordes. I get we're mid-outbreak, but it just doesn't end with these things. We also get to experience an unavoidable death if you happen to be standing in the wrong place after a random period of time. The rest of the chapter is more of the same, so we'll skip that and the beginning chunk of chapter 2 because it's again more of the same. I mean, RE5 was kind of like this, but this feels excessive. But at least we finally get puzzles. Sorry, I mean puzzles. Because these things are so simplistic, a toddler could figure them out. There's also a boss fight against whatever this is, but in typical Resident Evil fashion, you just pump them full of bullets until they're dead. More puzzles. And another boss fight that I can't show you because YouTube might actually crucify me. Just know there's a minecart section like in Resident Evil 4, but nowhere near as good. The only threat is the boss and a bunch of wooden boards, and all of those can be avoided by just lying down. There is almost nothing to mention in chapter 3, apart from terrible swimming controls and possibly the worst designed boss ever. The first phase is QTEs. The second phase is QTEs while swimming. The third phase is unloading into the glowy weak points in a turret section in all but name. On to chapter 4, and we have a good example of a major issue this game has: pacing. This chapter is 45 minutes long and has 4 separate boss fights. The game seems so worried that you'll lose interest that it just throws constant action at you. To be fair, RE4 and RE5 get like this in the latter stages themselves, but there's much more build up in those games and at least gives you some time to actually, relax between the sections. 6 barely lets off the gas in terms of intensity, and when it does, it's usually for some really tedious puzzles. This chapter is also where the other campaigns converge, which would be really cool. However, it does lead to another issue: the story. Because the plot is split between 3 separate campaigns, we have no idea what's going on. All we know for definite is Simmons is a bad man, Neo Umbrella exists, and Ada is simultaneously alive and dead. That's really it. We practically have nothing else to go on. So these parts where the campaigns meet do not land in the way the devs think they should. But at least we get Simmons yucking it up.
What? Are they running down the street screaming it to anyone who'll listen? We wrap this up. I do have better things to do.
I do love me a hammy villain. Chapter 5 is frankly a single boss fight and very tedious, like all RE bosses. Simmons becomes a big ass monster, because of course he does, and you have to fight him 3 times in 3 separate arenas. The first phase is very clear that someone wanted to make another Dino Crisis. I'm still waiting on a remake, Capcom, you cowards. Phase 2 features such highlights as climbing a cable and Simmons spouting some real creeper shite. But ignore all that. Who the hell thought this was a good idea? Who thought this was exciting and fun? And phase 3 is just standing behind impaled zombies until the boss kills itself. It's big and it's flashy, but it's so devoid of challenge, it's not even worth talking about in depth. Okay, so full disclosure, I was going to talk about Chris's campaign in a bit more detail, but honestly this just isn't Resident Evil. This is an aggressively average third-person shooter with the Resident Evil name plastered on the front. And this was the stuff people hated. Chris is running around an active war zone, for Christ's sake. In chapter 2, you fight 2 giant monsters, a tank and a railway gun, as well as hordes of mutant gunmen. And it just doesn't end. This chapter goes on for an hour. You know what I said about this game's pacing being ass? Maximum intensity for an hour goes from being an adrenaline rush to mind-numbingly tedious real fast. Now's as good a time as any to discuss another issue: the characterization, because in an attempt to make a more serious story, they made all of the characters so bland. Leon went from being a snarky cocksure badass in RE4
just because you killed my small-time subordinate.
Sadler, you're small time.
to being very dour. Helena is very one-note and feels like she exists just to progress the plot. Chris was never a very interesting character to begin with, but his character development is all over the place. He goes from a fart-sniffing hero complex to an alcoholic amnesiac to a vengeance-crazed bastard whenever the plot requires him to be, and seemingly at random. The only thing that vaguely redeems him is that he's paired with Piers, the most generic man to ever live. You could probably replace him with a cardboard cutout and get the exact same effect. Even his heroic sacrifice at the end of the campaign couldn't redeem him. They just aren't very interesting, which is pretty bad when the main protags are very storied at this point. And if for whatever reason they did make them like this for the story to stand out better, it failed because I genuinely struggled to care. But in the name of fairness, let's just quickfire the notable highlights of the campaign. Turret sections that do not line up with their own targeting reticles. A running section that blocks your way with enemies and can kill your AI partner if their pathing gets screwed. Whatever the hell is going on here, I'm not editing this. The game just does it. The most nauseating turret section in the history of gaming. I mean, this thing deserves some kind of award. A round of applause, people. Doesn't get much worse than this. A loathsome jet section where it feels like you're piloting a very aerodynamic brick. How does he even know how to pilot? No, Gremlin? You're thinking about this way too much. If there is one saving grace to this campaign, it's just how brutal Chris's melee attacks are. I mean, look at this nonsense. There is something very cathartic about Chris picking someone up and just yeeting them across the room. His time fighting boulders has clearly paid off. There is a word for Jake's campaign, and that word is bland. Bland as a dry cracker. Bland as a British menu. In an attempt to differentiate it from Chris and Leon, Capcom decided to give Jake some weird mini-gamey stuff, like picking up items spread over a featureless ice canyon, forced stealth sections, and running. A lot of running because Jake is being hounded by the Usternak, which is a very overt homage to Nemesis from RE3. But like everything else in this godforsaken game, it's a pale imitation because you only interact with him during the many running sections and forced fights. One of them is even a pure QTE fight, just in case you forgot the interplanetary boner this game has for QTEs. That being said, the final fight is some classic RE silliness when you fist fight him over a lake of lava, but that is almost immediately overshadowed by the most sickening shaky cam ever conceived by mortal man. Outside of the general blandness, it exposes the issue with the stories crossing. First off, you end up playing through sections you've already done before with absolutely no changes, and secondly, all the big reveals and plot twists have already happened in Leon and Chris's campaigns. Well, except the whole Ada thing, but we'll get to that shortly. But do you know what's really disappointing? The use of Sherry Birkin. She had the potential to be one of the most interesting characters in RE canon, and personally I feel could have been great as a protagonist in her own game, but she's relegated to babysitting Jake in a subpar one. There's still time for her to appear in more mainline titles, but I don't hold out much hope. So let's quickly review what we have so far. Average gameplay, tedious pacing, poor characterization, a plot that exists, and a camera that is in desperate need of an exorcist. It's all looking like a pretty bad case for RE6, but we do have one last campaign, and oh boy is it a good one. That's not sarcasm, by the way, I'm actually being serious. Ada's campaign is largely well designed. The chapters, while roughly the same length as the rest of the games, are so well paced, and it balances action sequence with downtime and actually has some goddamn puzzles. And no, not just the press the button in a certain order BS Leon's campaign had. I mean honest to goodness RE puzzles. It even has actual decent stealth sections, which after Jake's story I thought wasn't actually possible. And we finally get an explanation for what's actually happening in the game. So as a very brief synopsis, Simmons wants to bone Ada. Ada flipped him off and disappeared for 15 years. Simmons, like any reasonable human being, decided he was going to try to clone her and create a completely obedient copy of Ada. To that end, he enlisted Carla, the person that created the C virus, to assist. 12,000 failed attempts later, Simmons decides to use Carla as a base, and it works! Until it doesn't. Carla then aims to destroy the world because Simmons' family controls it or some guff. Just in very basic terms, the world was almost completely destroyed because some guy couldn't get his rocks off and took it very personally. It's really just a cautionary tale for why incels shouldn't have money. And the worst thing? Before they patched the game, you had to play all 3 other campaigns to discover this subpar plot explanation. Anyway, is Ada's campaign perfect? No. The final act is literally just a turret section followed by the second part of Leon's final boss. And then there's this asshole. But the highs far outstrip the lows. So overall, is RE6 as bad as I remember? No. It's actually way worse. It's so marred in weird design choices, gameplay decisions, and awkward storytelling that it just isn't that good of a game on its own, let alone a good Resident Evil game. I can only imagine its sales are as good as they are because people found out how bad it was and the morbid fascination led them to try it themselves. I hope you enjoyed. Once again, please leave a like and subscribe if you enjoyed, and let me know what you think in the comments. I have been the Resident Gremlin, and I just played RE6 to complain about it.